Now, in the second part of Chapter 30, we can discuss a completely different element of American life during the late 60s and into the early 70s, and that is the conservative aspect. Okay? In particular, the presidency of Richard Nixon, okay? Because this becomes a major turning point for a lot of Americans and provides, again, kind of this counter to everything that we've seen in terms of the protest movements and the major social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s. Nixon is elected in 1968 primarily on what he refers to as support from the quote-unquote silent majority. Okay, these are the silent majority is what he refers to as the individuals who are the working and middle-class white Americans in society opposed to the idea of a permissive society. Okay, people who are conservative, who do not take part in any of the political protests, and who basically try to stay out of the way and could keep the status quo in a conservative sense, okay, for better or for worse. And he is characterized as a president as being a person who is a little man in a big hurry, quote unquote, and also someone who has a mean and vindictive streak, okay, and these become the most salient features of Richard Nixon, okay, as president, as vice president, as someone who has had a record in the past of, trying to get ahead in life. Richard Nixon ends up becoming the president who is stereotyped in the 20th century as being potentially the worst president in the country, right? Someone who has gained a reputation as being very mean, very conniving, and being ultimately a liar, right? He gains that much of a reputation over time. He is considered to be as someone who is resentful of the quote-unquote money class due to having an impoverished upbringing. And it's kind of ironic that he's actually opposed to a lot of the more liberal aspects of society, because as a young man, if you recall, he grew up during the Great Depression, during Franklin Roosevelt's administration, and actually received a bit of patronage from the National Youth Association. Right, actually was given a job as a student worker and given employment as a direct result of this. So over time, he ends up kind of forgetting where he came from. And he also, the further along he gets in his presidency anyway, he ends up being characterized by several violent mood swings. Okay? He has temper tantrums on a constant basis. Many of them are profanity-laden and are also characterized by being very anti-Semitic. Okay, so he is very much known for speaking his mind. Okay, and in most cases, it's not a positive message. And ultimately, he earns the nickname Tricky Dick because he is considered to be a very good liar. Okay, and lying becomes a key feature of his presidency, and one main reason why a lot of Americans from the Nixon administration forward tend to distrust presidents. And his cabinet is worth mentioning as well here, worth kind of examining for a moment. They're all staffed by white men who follow orders completely blindly. Right, they're totally and completely dedicated to Nixon 100%. His attorney general is a man named John Mitchell. He's Nixon's closest confidant in all this, and is a former law partner with Nixon. Nixon used to be an attorney. The chief of staff under Nixon is H.R. Haldeman, also known as Bob Haldeman. He's a former ad executive. John Ehrlichman is the chief domestic policy advisor. He and Haldeman were schoolmates and friends. John Dean III is the White House legal counsel. William Rogers is the Secretary of State, also a friend of Nixon and a former Attorney General. And finally, Henry Kissinger, right, who's a national security advisor, eventually becomes Secretary of State. Kissinger is a Harvard political scientist and eventually becomes considered the U.S. leading foreign policy expert. Very controversial individual, as we'll see over time. Now, the primary concern for Richard Nixon leading into his first term in office is to gain the support of the South. Okay, and remember, at this point in time, the South is already in a large political shift. Okay, we're starting to see the South move away from the Democratic Party because, as we've seen with the last two Democratic presidents, Democrats have gradually begun to adopt more social justice reforms, more social welfare programs, and so forth. And the conservative white contingency of the South begins to look at this as being too favorable to the civil rights movement and to African Americans and minorities. parties. Okay, so the South begins to polarize very much so, especially during this particular election. And again, the Southerners feel alienated by the Democratic Party because they have traditionally voted Democrat. Okay? The Democratic Party used to be associated with, again, with white supremacy in some cases, was associated with the Confederacy a very, very long time ago. And most of the individuals who are voting conservative in the South are religious, they're patriotic, they're very, very anti-communist, and they're extremely skeptical of social welfare programs, again, because in part of white supremacist rhetoric, and also because they believe that they are not receiving any kind of benefit from this. And there is still, even over 100 years later, a lingering resentment toward the Republican Party for being the quote-unquote party of Lincoln, for imposing its way of life on the South during Reconstruction. Okay? And again, this is something that is still a sore point for Southerners even during this point in time. And Nixon, when he starts to campaign for the presidency in 1968, he promises that he is going to appoint more Supreme Court justices who will undermine civil rights laws, especially when it comes to affirmative action and busing individuals outside of their school districts so that they can have equal education. And in 1972, the South officially realigns politically with the Republican Party. Okay? This is the first time that this actually ends up happening. And the South becomes transformed during the 60s and 70s, primarily by its population growth, right? We get a lot more conservative elements of society beginning to migrate to the Sun Belt, okay? A lot more economic improvement begins to happen. So for the first time in well over 100 years since the period of Reconstruction, the South is finally starting to catch up with the rest of the country. And between 1970 and 1990, it's estimated that there's a 40% population growth that occurs. It's over twice the national average. And of course, there's all kinds of motivations for people to come to the South. There's a warmer climate, lower living costs, there's fewer labor unions, lower taxes, and there's more government incentives for economic development. Okay, so more and more businesses are beginning to relocate to the South. And suddenly, there is this massive spread of Southern quote-unquote redneck culture that occurs all over the country. Okay, so everything from stock car racing to cowboy boots, pickup trucks, barbecue, country music, films like Smokey and the Bandit, TV shows like The Dukes of Hazzard, all of these suddenly become this brand new element of society, especially going into the 1970s. Okay? And also, it's worth noting, every president elected between 1964 and 2008 has some kind of roots in the South, in the Sun Belt. Now, when it comes to Nixon and the way that he associates himself with the executive branch, he believes, just like his two predecessors, in the idea of increased executive power. In Nixon's case, though, it's to a much more selfish extent. Okay? He believes that the presidency should be the central source of all government action. Okay? In other words, he's not really willing to adhere to congressional standards, okay, or for the legislative and executive branches to work in tandem with one another. He believes that all foreign policy should be managed from the White House rather than the State Department. And he believes that war should be waged primarily by the president without congressional approval. Okay, so we're hearkening back now even to the Truman era. Even though Truman himself was a Democrat, right? We still have this sense of, how can we put this? Putting it all on the president's shoulders, right? Micromanaging the country, quite frankly. And he starts touting what he refers to as new federalism. This is the biggest feature of Nixon's first term in office to guarantee that he is reelected. Okay? In other words, new federalism is where he grants more rights to the states themselves. He sends federal funds to state and local governments to spend the money however they see fit. Okay? And he also goes so far as to disband the Office of Economic Opportunity. Okay? So he starts cutting funding to all sorts of great society programs right and left. So he is effectively undoing everything that that Lyndon Johnson has done during his presidency. And the biggest stumbling block that Nixon has when it comes to legislation is the fact that we have a Democratic Congress and a Republican president. Okay, so nothing really overly effective gets done in the long run, although there are a few pieces of key legislation that are signed in the first term, most of them bipartisan. First one is the 26th Amendment. This gives 18-year-olds the right to vote in all elections. Okay, so if you are at least 18, you're registered to vote, you're a citizen, you can vote now. The Occupational Safety and Health Act is passed, OSHA. Okay, this guarantees greater workplace safety. So if you feel like your workplace conditions are not up to snuff, or if your workers' rights are being violated, you call OSHA now. Federal Election Campaign Act is also passed. This is something that says that corporate donations to a particular presidential campaign have to be limited. There has to be a price ceiling on this. And when it comes to Nixon's association with civil rights progression, he actively attempts to block it every chance he gets. He appoints no African Americans to his cabinet. He refuses to meet with the all-Democratic Congressional Black Caucus. And he even attempts to block the renewal of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, okay, and tries to even delay implementation of integration, okay, even though the Supreme Court orders it. And this especially comes to the forefront with the Supreme Court case of Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education in 1971. This is what says that in order for school districts to be able to integrate appropriately, black students have to be bused outside of the district into white school districts, traditionally white school districts, okay? And it leads to widespread protests over the idea of busing black students into traditionally white schools. Now, in 1969, Nixon also signs into law the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. Okay, and when it comes to the latter, this is what gives us Earth Day. Okay, so basically we have an environmental protection agency that now exists to basically make sure that that no pollution occurs, that oil spills are cleaned up very quickly, that no kind of toxic waste is dumped anywhere. And two new agencies are created in 1970 as a direct result of these two acts. Okay, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and we have the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Okay, and NOAA is the one that monitors hurricane activity in the oceans and also makes sure that any kind of, again, toxic spills of any kind, oil or whatever, are cleaned up. Okay, so it's meant to preserve the environment. During the Nixon era, one of the other key features of the economy is that it's in a very, very poor state. Okay? The aspects of the Vietnam War combined with the extreme cost of the Great Society programs ends up leading to us having what is essentially 4 times the actual annual inflation rate, from 1967 to 1974. Okay, so inflation rate has gone up dramatically. And the rest of the country is not able to really keep up with it. Okay, so we have a massive spike in unemployment from 3.3% to 6% from 68 to 70. And part of that has to do with the flood of new workers in the United States, right? Some of them are college students, some of them are immigrants who are coming from Mexico and so forth. And we enter into a strange period called stagflation. Okay, this is a stalled economic growth, stagnation, combined with a rising inflation and high unemployment. Okay, so we have stagnation and inflation occurring at the exact same time, something that doesn't happen very often. And so there's no major tax increase under LBJ when it comes to Vietnam. This is another major problem. Okay, and so this leads to a larger federal deficit, right? These major Great Society programs, a lot of the money has been siphoned directly out of them to fund the Vietnam War. So when Nixon cuts these programs, suddenly this money has to come from somewhere, okay? And it primarily ends up coming from the pockets of the American taxpayer instead, okay? So price inflations end up going out of control. Money supply ends up shrinking a little bit. And so now all these companies in the U.S. are facing a lot of international competition with places like West Germany and Japan, because now they have these countries that are beginning to export technology, right? This is when you start to see, technology that says made in Japan or made in West Germany and so forth. And now, for the first time since 1945, American prosperity is suddenly starting to dip a little bit, okay? And most of our prosperity has happened in part because we have cheap, readily available energy sources, most of them having to do with the oil industry. Okay, we were the largest producer of oil in the world for a very long period of time, and now with all this economic boom that we had after the war, there's a widespread oil shortage. And OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decides it's going to use its oil supply, which ends up dramatically outpacing the U.S., as a political and economic weapon the later we get into the 60s and into the 70s. And OPEC countries are primarily Arab countries in the Middle East, okay? Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, places like that. In 1973, the U.S., in hindsight, seems to make a major mistake in sending aid to Israel when it comes to a Syrian and Egyptian attack on Yom Kippur. This is sometimes called the Yom Kippur War. So we end up supporting Israel instead of the Arab-speaking nations, okay? And OPEC decides that it's not going to sell oil to countries that have supported Israel, okay? And instead, it institutes a 400% price hike, okay? And suddenly, there is a massive petroleum shortage and gas shortage in the United States. And so Nixon tries to combat this by reducing a federal deficit, raising taxes, cutting budgets, and Congress, which is all Democratic, refuses to cooperate, okay? So now all of a sudden we have gas shortages in the United States, okay? And you see images like what you see in the background, okay? People have to put up signs in gas stations saying, we have no gas here, keep driving. There is also a recession that ensues, okay? The National Reserve Board starts to raise interest rates to try to reduce the money supply as much as it can. And to make matters worse when it comes to the Vietnam conflict, in 1969, Nixon and Kissinger decided that they are going to form a new world order of sorts and transform U.S. foreign policy. Part of this is due to the fact that the U.S. no longer holds monopolies on the stuff that it had at the end of the Second World War. Okay? We are no longer the only country that has nuclear weapons. We do no longer have economic dominance over the rest of the world, and we don't have the geopolitical influence that we used to have. So now, instead, what we start to pursue is this idea of what is called détente. Okay, it's a peaceful coexistence with the Soviets and with the Chinese, both of which are communist countries now. And so Nixon and Henry Kissinger decide they're going to bypass the State Department altogether. They're not going to consult Congress, and they're going to attempt to end the Vietnam War in secret. Part of this incorporates a draft lottery that Nixon decides to implement in 1969. Okay? So now, if you are a young college student, if you are given you're given a lottery ticket, and if your number comes up, then you are automatically drafted to go fight in Vietnam. Okay, primarily because we end up losing a massive amount of soldiers on a regular basis. So Nixon and Kissinger decide they're going to transform their policy on Vietnam on 3 different fronts. Okay. First thing is the U.S. negotiators are going to demand the withdrawal of all Viet Cong from South Vietnam, and they're going to try to preserve the administration of Nguyen Van Thieu, the guy who is in charge of South Vietnam. He's backed by the U.S. government. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong insist, though, on unifying Vietnam under communism. That is what they want. Second thing is what Nixon refers to as Vietnamization. Okay, this is where we are going to try to withdraw troops from Vietnam, U.S. troops that is, and instead we are going to train the South Vietnamese to assume the combat burden. In other words, we are going to train South Vietnamese soldiers to fight and then withdraw all U.S. troops afterward. From 1969 to 1973, though, instead of withdrawing troops, U.S. troop numbers in Vietnam they do actually end up decreasing from 560,000 to only 50,000. Okay, but it leads to widespread chaos as a result. Okay, the withdrawal of troops ends up leading to greater aggression by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And in March of 1969, the U.S. commences a 14-month-long bombing campaign on North Vietnam. Okay, and we end up dropping 4 times the total payload that's dropped on Japan during World War II. On April 30th, Nixon announces an incursion into Cambodia to quote-unquote clean out the hidden communist bases that exist there. So now we're branching off out of Vietnam into Cambodia and into Laos as well. In 1969, another event ends up occurring that is actually brought into the American mainstream as referred to as the My Lai Massacre. Okay? And it surrounds an event that occurred in March of 1968 involving a U.S. lieutenant named William Calley, or also known as Rusty Calley, and that he and his troops enter into the Vietnamese village of My Lai, and he orders 347 Vietnamese civilians to be killed. Okay? And the reason that he does this, or the reason that's given anyway, is the fact that the Viet Cong in South Vietnam have the ability, again, to blend into the background. Okay, they incorporate men, women, and children into their army. They don't wear uniforms, and basically, Calley uses the excuse that he doesn't know where the Viet Cong are hiding, and he believes that they are hiding amongst this population. In the aftermath of it, after this news gets back to the American public and is actually published in the newspapers, 25 Army officers are charged with complicity and cover-up in the matter, and that the My Lai massacre was not supposed to get back to the American public. And Calley himself is actually convicted in all this, but Nixon later grants him parole. And by 1970, anti-war demonstrations begin to increase more and more once the U.S. ends up getting involved in Cambodia. On May 4th, one of the biggest and most violent instances occurs when it comes to American anti-war protests at Kent State University. The Ohio National Guardsmen are called out, and they form a line of riflemen pointing their guns at the protesters who are protesting peacefully. And a young woman is actually photographed at one point placing flowers into the gun barrels of each one of the rifles. And something occurs in the midst of all this, where the National Guardsmen open fire on the protesters and they kill 4 people and wound 13. The aftermath of this is there's actually a very famous photograph of a young college student woman who's actually screaming at the camera while one of her friends lies face down and dead on the ground. 4 days later, a group of New York construction workers attack a group of anti-war protesters on the street, and they beat them with wrenches and sledgehammers. A week after that, a group of Mississippi Highway patrolmen end up shooting up a Jackson State College dormitory, killing 2 student protesters in the process. So protests against the Vietnam War become increasingly violent the further along we get. And by 1971, the American public is more and more aware of the tactics being used by soldiers in Vietnam, and a lot of the public opinion has started to turn against the war. In June, the New York Times actually begins publishing a Defense Department study that was done in secret, and was actually leaked to the press by a former DOD official named Daniel Ellsberg, who you see here, as referred to as the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers are extremely incendiary because they reveal the truth of what occurred in the Gulf of Tonkin, right? This is what led to the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, what actually involved the U.S. more in the Vietnam War in the first place. It's all founded on a lie. And it also reveals the contingency plans that LBJ put forth, basically saying that he denied that he had any such plans to send troops to Vietnam, and yet he turned right around and did it anyway. And Nixon attempts to block all publication of this, tried to basically save the face of the U.S. government, and the Supreme Court ends up shooting him down in this. They rule 6-3 in favor of the newspapers, who end up publishing it all. By 1972, Kissinger ends up renewing private meetings with the North Vietnamese negotiators in Paris. And he ends up finally dropping his insistence that the North Vietnamese troops withdraw first from South Vietnam before the U.S. troops do. Okay, so Kissinger actually makes a concession that becomes very, very unpopular. Okay, the North Vietnamese are still under the auspices of Ho Chi Minh at this point, who really is a nationalist leader who is being forced to cooperate with the South or the Viet Cong forces. Okay, so the communist forces and Ho Chi Minh eventually end up joining forces in the long run because the Chinese end up granting patronage to the North Vietnamese. On October 26, Kissinger announces to the U.S. public that peace is at hand. Okay? Unfortunately, though, this is a lie just to guarantee that Richard Nixon is reelected to the presidency, which he is. The regime under Juan Van Thieu in South Vietnam ends up rejecting Kissinger's plan for a ceasefire. He's worried that the communists are going to gain control of the country. And on December 16th, Nixon orders bombings of Hanoi and Haiphong, two of the largest cities in North Vietnam. By January, though, of 1973, we finally get the Paris Peace Accords being signed by the U.S., North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong representatives. Okay, and ostensibly, this brings the Vietnam War to an end. Okay, on the surface, in an official capacity, this is when it's supposed to end. North Vietnamese, though, end up tricking the U.S. forces into being content with what they have to offer. Okay, in reality, they have every intention of reneging on this promise. 150,000 North Vietnamese troops are still kept in South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese are committed to reunifying Vietnam under communist rule still. Okay, remember, the nationalist Vietnamese are now joined forces with the communists to try to reunite Vietnam as a communist nation. And it doesn't take long before fighting resumes in Vietnam and Cambodia. And the actual end of the Vietnam War is something that is still a very big point of shame for the United States, if nothing else. And it's really embodied in the photograph you see here in the background. This is actually when Saigon is actually overrun by communist forces, and all U.S. Diplomats, all U.S. citizens who are working and living in Saigon actually end up evacuating the city, and several South Vietnamese citizens try to board the helicopters. And this particular image is of a U.S. citizen actually punching a South Vietnamese man in the face to kick him off the helicopter. In March of 1973, the last U.S. troops finally leave Vietnam, and 600 American POWs, most of whom are pilots, are released from prison camps in Hanoi. But it doesn't take long before the ceasefire collapses. Okay? Communists very quickly take over Cambodia. They rename it the Khmer Republic. And they also end up taking over Laos as well. So Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, all three end up falling to communist forces. And in 1975, North Vietnam launches a full-scale invasion of South Vietnam to reclaim it. When Van Thieu begs the U.S. to provide aid, Nixon, though, has said that the door is closed, that we're not going to provide you with any more aid. On April 21st of 75, Thieu resigns and flees to Taiwan. And 9 days later, the North Vietnamese invade Saigon, and it's actually televised in America. Okay, the South Vietnamese know that the communists are coming. They know that it's only a matter of time, and there is a mass panic that ensues, like you see in the photograph in the background, with American citizens and some South Vietnamese trying to basically storm American airports to be airlifted out of the country. There are instances where young mothers are actually holding up their babies to American GIs and American citizens saying, "Take my child, the communists are going to kill him." And so it's just mass hysteria that ends up ensuing. And once the communists do come in and they take over the city, they rename it Ho Chi Minh City, which it still is today. Combined death count for all civilians and combatants in the war in Vietnam is nearly 2 million. And the U.S. ends up spending more than $669 billion, and that's in the 60s and 70s. I mean, adjusted for inflation, it's dramatically more than it would have been. And once the U.S.-backed Khmer Republic falls to the Cambodian communist insurgents, it's called the Khmer Rouge, we end up with a dramatic genocidal campaign led by Pol Pot. Okay, this is another seemingly parenthetical event that occurs during the time, but it's a major totalitarian regime that comes in, and Pol Pot commits genocide against anyone in the country, kills 1/3 of the entire population of Cambodia, and enslaves the other 2/3. trying to take them back to essentially an agrarian society, trying to bring back the medieval Khmer Empire. Is an ancient empire led by a series of divine kings. And for many baby boomers, Vietnam is the defining event, right? It's the one major event that they remember from their childhood, from young adulthood. And beginning with Vietnam, U.S. respect for the military among citizens tends to be eroded dramatically, right? A lot of people tend to not trust the military, to not trust the government, because the government lied and the military lied in many cases. And so a lot of combat veterans, when they do manage to come home, they're not really greeted with a hero's welcome. Some of them rocks are thrown at them, people spit on them, and they develop post-traumatic stress disorder in some cases, not only because of their experiences in Vietnam, which are extremely horrific, but also just by rejection of their own constituents, their own people when they come home. Now, concerning Nixon and Kissinger's approach to foreign policy, the desire here is to just really go back to an Eisenhower-era approach to dealing with foreign countries, okay? And, of course, it's no surprise that Nixon is actually Eisenhower's VP, his former VP, so he liked the way that his old boss did this and decided he was going to carry it forward. And, of course, the Eisenhower era was marked by the use of the CIA to engage in some kind of subterfuge with foreign nations, okay, some kind of a large-scale military intervention. And in July of 1969, Nixon reveals what is known as the Nixon Doctrine, okay, and so this is again, one of these time periods where we have a presidential foreign policy that is named after the president in question. And the whole idea of the Nixon Doctrine is that the U.S. cannot and will not be directly involved militarily in the defense of other countries against communism. Okay, and this is kind of a weird step in this direction, because Nixon seems like he doesn't quite follow through with this on Vietnam, at least not very quickly or not very efficiently anyway. And the practice of easing relations with the Soviet Union and with the Chinese, as we've said before, is called détente. Okay, this is basically trying to make peace with communist countries out of some sense of mutual interest, right? Basically that if we continue to be enemies with the communist nations of the world, it's only going to create further strife and further contention. In 1971, Nixon orders Kissinger to go to Beijing and try to explore as much how the communist system works and whether or not the U.S. is going to be capable of recognizing communist China as the official form of Chinese government. And by this point, both China and the U.S. have been involved in plenty of domestic strife, right? We've had the counterculture movement and all the protest movements in the United States. China has been involved in a civil war for a long time against the nationalist Chinese. So there's plenty of, mutual exhaustion here going on between these two countries. And both of them are really still trying to fight against Soviet expansionism, okay? Even though China, at this point, as a communist nation, has been directly sponsored by the Soviet Union has always looked down on China as being something like a little brother, right? Kind of given it a hard time, told it how it needs to operate, point out its faults every time it does something that the Soviet Union thinks is wrong. So there's plenty of built-up resentment by the communist Chinese against the Soviet Union at this point. And on July 15th of 1971, Nixon publicly announces to the American people that Kissinger has come back from Beijing and that he also has intent to visit China the following year. Okay, so this would be the very first time that a U.S. president has visited a communist country since the Cold War began. Okay. And Nixon even takes it a step further and officially recognizes the People's Republic of China as the official Chinese government. And this is pretty devastating to the nationalist government in Taiwan. Okay, the UN votes to admit Communist China as its official representative, and it completely expels Taiwan. So Taiwan is really left out in the cold in this case. In February of 1972, Nixon officially arrives in Beijing, and he brings nearly 100 different journalists with him to try to document his visit, right, to show that he is capable of making peace with a foreign country. And there's photographs of him shaking hands, drinking toasts on television with the Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and the Communist Party chairman Mao Zedong, who you see him shaking hands with in the photograph in the background here. And this ends 2 full decades of diplomatic isolation for Communist China. I mean, China has officially alienated most of the countries that it's been in any kind of dialogue with in the past, simply because of the Chinese Civil War that's occurred. Okay, it's taken control of Tibet. It's taken control of course, of mainland China. It's expelled nationalist Chinese onto the island of Taiwan. Now Taiwan has been left out in the cold. So there's plenty of resentment from other countries around China, and so for the U.S. to be the one to extend an olive branch here is a pretty big deal. And the U.S. and the Communist Chinese agree that they are going to engage in scientific and cultural exchanges. There's going to be a resumption of trade for the first time in over 20 years. And eventually, the Chinese say that they are going to reunify Taiwan with mainland China. Now, of course, we're not getting directly involved in any military intervention in China, right, to try to prevent the Communist Chinese from taking over Taiwan or anything like that. So again, Taiwan is kind of getting the bad end of the deal here. And again, we end up with a liaison office in Washington and in Beijing. So now we have a direct line between the United States and China. And in 1979, this diplomatic recognition is formalized, and each country officially recognizes each other as being in good standing. And this helps the United States gain a little bit of leverage with the Soviet Union, because again, the Communist Chinese don't really have a whole lot of love for the Soviet Union at this point, right? They feel like they can stand on their own 2 feet without all of the social pressuring and the diplomatic pressuring from the Soviets. Now, further on in the year, Nixon also announces that he is going to go directly to Moscow and meet with Leonid Brezhnev. And Brezhnev, at this point, has succeeded Nikita Khrushchev as this will be the 3rd generation following Stalin's death. Okay, so we had Stalin, we had Khrushchev, and now we had Brezhnev. And again, he ends up entering into the idea of détente with the Soviet Union, just like he did with China. Okay, we're going to try to make peace with the Soviets. We're going to try to engage in some kind of scientific and diplomatic exchange and try to get along as best as possible. Okay. And so the first thing that Nixon and Brezhnev end up signing is what's called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, sometimes called SALT I. And this limits the number of missiles that have nuclear warheads on them, and it also prohibits the construction of missile defense systems. Okay, so basically, it's an act of good faith between the 2 countries that we're not going to try to build any kind of deterrent, right? Any kind of nuclear deterrent. And if we are, it's a signal to the other country that we've lost trust and that things are going bad. We also end up with a new trade agreement. The U.S. sells about 1/4 of its wheat crop to the Soviets as an act of goodwill. And Soviet hostility toward the U.S. is starting to go on the decline all of a sudden. Okay, and this is a good thing for the U.S. because it helps erode communist rule. Okay, the communists are not so volatile anymore against the United States. I mean, we've gotten pretty close to, what is it now, about 30 years since World War II has ended, and so that communist aggression has kind of started to recede a little bit here. In October of 1973, we've discussed this a little bit already. Syria and Egypt, who are backed by the Soviet-armed Saudi Arabians, end up attacking Israel on Yom Kippur, and this is where we get the Yom Kippur War. The Israelis end up launching a counterattack, which threatens to overwhelm Egypt, and the Soviets actually threaten to intervene on the behalf of Egypt. Okay, so the Soviets are in pretty good standing with the Arab nations, especially the OPEC nations. And Kissinger here is forced to preside over a National Security Council meeting, and he places U.S. military forces on high alert here, and he says, what we're going to do instead here is we are actually going to support Israel. And in so doing, this is what causes OPEC to actually use its resources as a weapon against us. And so it ends up spiking prices on gasoline by over 400%. October 20th, Kissinger actually flies directly to Moscow to meet with Brezhnev and negotiates a ceasefire. And this is what is known as shuttle diplomacy. It's basically where Kissinger gets on an airplane and basically jumps from one city to the next, basically flies on a shuttle from one place to the next, and actually engages in a treaty on the spot, right? Comes to an agreement in a short period of time. Okay, so it's kind of an expedited form of diplomacy. Now, by 1972, Nixon's foreign policy achievements have gained him a lot of popularity in the United States. Right? People think that he is, it's enough to warrant him 4 more years in office. And his primary campaign threat here in terms of getting the conservative vote is George Wallace. Okay, remember George Wallace separated from the Democratic Party in one of the previous 2 elections and actually ended up running on an independent party ticket as what amounted to, repudiating desegregation and white supremacy and all that kind of stuff. For George Wallace, though, unfortunately, on May 15th of 1972, he actually is caught in an assassination attempt and is shot in the spine, which leaves him paralyzed below the waist. You see him here sitting in a wheelchair. And it's devastating enough to him that he actually ends up withdrawing from the campaign. You see the look on his face kind of says it all. And the Democrats end up nominating South Dakota senator named George McGovern as an anti-war liberal to try to push Nixon out of the White House. Unfortunately for McGovern, though, he has very poor campaigning experience, and his speech making leaves a lot to be desired. He's not very charismatic, and can't really gain the public interest as much as Nixon has. And Nixon, by this point, is already chronically insecure. Okay, he nurses grudges whenever he has them. Again, he's a president who ends up taking most slights very personally. And he also, unfortunately, begins keeping a secret enemies list. Okay, so Nixon is very much out to get those who are against him here. And we'll kind of see how all that ends up playing out now. Beginning with the spring of 1972, this can potentially be looked at as the beginning of the end for Nixon. Because his administration, as soon as the election of 1972 starts to roll around, becomes evident over time that Nixon engages in some acts of sabotage against the Democratic Party. Okay, he orders illegal wiretaps on all of his opponents and also on his own aides in the process because he's starting to not trust anybody. The big moment that ends up occurring that leads to the gigantic controversy that follows happens on June 17th, when there is a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. Okay, and the Watergate is a hotel and office building complex. The 4 burglars who are captured are CIA trained, they're right-wing Cuban exiles, and one of them is a Nixon campaign worker. Now, while all this happens in the aftermath of this, Nixon actually provides $400,000 to the burglars to buy their silence. Okay, so these men have been working on behalf of Richard Nixon and his campaign. Okay? These men lie to the journalists and they destroy evidence on behalf of Nixon. And once the FBI gets involved, it is actually ordered to stop the investigation directly by Nixon's chief of staff. Okay, so his entire administration is suddenly complicit in a major cover-up here. Things really start to boil over, though, because in September of 1972, a few months later, the Washington Post, with the aid of 2 reporters named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who you see here in the background, 2 young men still working, they both report that the grand jury indictment, in addition to the co-conspirators, so Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, 2 men who are actually directly involved in all this, they report this in the Washington Post to the American people, okay, that the president is involved somehow. On October 10th, Woodward and Bernstein also reveal a connection between the Watergate burglary and the committee to re-elect the president. So this is where they actually cement things. Okay, so the grand jury indictment of the burglars is made public first, then they reveal the connection to the president. And on October 27th, it gets all the way to CBS. Okay, and Walter Cronkite, who at the time was probably one of the most trusted reporters in America, announces on TV that the Watergate scandal is an act of political sabotage by the president. Now, by January of 1973 is when the trial of the actual burglars takes place, okay, and things very, very quickly unravel after this. James McCord, who's a security chief for the Committee to Re-elect the President, ironically nicknamed Creep, he becomes the very first informant against Nixon. Okay, he actually starts to inform the prosecution about everything that's going on here. Okay, he tells them that all the money gathered through the Committee to Re-elect the President has been used to fund several what are called dirty tricks against Democrats. Okay, and basically what this amounts to is anybody who is a political opponent of Nixon's is some kind of setup has been done against them. So some of them, rumors are spread that politicians who are Democrats are having affairs, that they are laundering money, that they are digging up dirt on their own opponents. Right? He's basically doing everything he can to sabotage other people's political careers. And Nixon coaches all of his aides who are testifying to lie under oath. Okay? Now, L. Patrick Gray ends up resigning from the FBI after he confesses to the prosecution that he has destroyed documents on the behalf of Nixon, okay? That Nixon ordered him to destroy incriminating evidence. And on April 30th, Ehrlichman, who is the counsel for Nixon, along with the Chief of Staff, Haldeman, and the Attorney General, who you see here, Richard Kleindienst, all resign from office because they realize that Nixon has caught them in the middle of something that they didn't want to get involved in. Okay, and Nixon actually gets on American TV and tells the American people that he is not a crook. Right? He says, this is all a pack of lies, and I'm completely innocent, and blah blah blah. Meanwhile, the White House legal counsel, the young man named John Dean, testifies that Nixon officially approved a cover-up. Okay, so all of his men are suddenly turning against him here. And now Nixon is embroiled in some kind of a self-defense. Okay, and he actually cites the term executive privilege multiple times. This has been touted by a couple of presidents since then. And meanwhile, his own aides are testifying against him, saying that Nixon has been wiretapping his enemies, that he's been wiretapping them, that he's been wiretapping everybody, basically, without telling anyone. In October, Archibald Cox, who is the special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate scandal, is ordered fired by Richard Nixon. Okay, so now Nixon is not only trying to cover things up, he's also trying to obstruct justice by actually firing the prosecutor. On the 20th, the Secretary of Defense, a young man named Elliot Richardson, and Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus, all resign as well. Okay, so Elliot Richardson is the first guy here. Ruckelshaus is the second guy. They both resign because they know that they don't want to serve Nixon, right, if they're going to get involved in this. And the Solicitor General is the one who actually ends up firing Cox. He's the one who actually follows through. Okay, the other men who were ordered to do so resign rather than fire him. Okay, so Robert Bork, the Solicitor General, is the one who fires him. And once that happens, now the public realizes what is going on, and they call for Nixon to be impeached. And his approval rating plummets down to only 17%. At the time, this was the lowest approval rating of any president in U.S. history. When March 1974 comes around, now we're really getting to the end of things. The grand jury for the Watergate trial ends up indicting the White House counsel, the Chief of Staff, and the former Attorney General for obstruction of justice. Okay, so this is a very, very serious charge. And Nixon is named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the midst of all this. So, again, for the president to be pointed to in the midst of all this means that his political career is in the middle of the bullseye. On the 30th, Nixon releases 1,254 pages of redacted transcribed recordings rather than the actual official tapes of the wiretaps. Okay, and Nixon unfortunately recorded everything. You can actually go onto the Library of Congress and listen to a lot of the tapes that actually exist. In fact, they can even be found on YouTube in some cases. Some of them are just profanity-laden rants. Some of them are private discussions that he has with his aides and so forth. But he recorded everything because he believed that once his political career came to an end, then he would be able to write a memoir. Okay, so unfortunately, all of this ends up backfiring on him. On July 24th, the Supreme Court rules in the case U.S. versus Richard M. Nixon that he must surrender all the tapes or be found in contempt, essentially. And when he refuses, the House Judiciary Committee votes to recommend 3 articles for impeachment against Nixon. First one is obstruction of justice, basically saying that he paid hush money to people who were working for him, and he withheld and destroyed evidence. Abuse of power is the second one. Basically, he used federal agencies to deprive individuals of rights and to basically keep himself in office. And the third one is defiance of Congress, right? Withholding the tapes in general, refusing to hand them over. On August 9, 1974, Nixon does something incredibly unthinkable, and it's the first and only time this has ever happened in U.S. history. He resigns from office. Okay, so in the midst of all this, even though he faces impeachment, Richard Nixon was never actually impeached. He never actually sat through an impeachment trial. He was threatened with it, and knowing that it was going to happen and that he probably would not win because the Congress was still Democratic at this point, he resigned rather than actually face it. Okay. And he's the first and only president to ever do this. And immediately after Nixon leaves office, Congress passes several different pieces of legislation to make sure that this does not happen again. Okay? First one is called the War Powers Act. This requires that a president has to inform Congress within 48 hours if troops are deployed for any reason. Okay? This is basically to make sure that, the kind of thing that Nixon and Kissinger were trying to do in Vietnam doesn't happen again. And if this does happen, if a president does do this, it also requires that troops have to be withdrawn after 60 days if congressional approval is not obtained. Okay, so there's a window of opportunity here. Even though a lot of damage can be done in that short amount of time, president has to obey by this. New ceilings are set on all political contributions and expenditures, so there's only so much that someone can donate to a presidential campaign. And there's a strengthening of the 1966 Freedom of Information Act. So you have to provide a very prompt response if the government requests information from you. Now, on the same day that Nixon resigns, his vice president, Gerald Ford, is sworn in as the very first politically appointed president in U.S. history. Okay? He's not elected, he's actually appointed. And he's appointed under the 25th Amendment. Okay? 25th Amendment states that if a president is unfit to serve in office for one reason or another, then his successor will be appointed. Okay, and Nixon chose Ford as the next in the line of succession. Okay, in the case of an emergency of some kind, if the president is put out of commission, then it goes to the vice president, then it goes to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and to another designated individual after that. Okay, so Ford is actually the first appointed president we've ever had. And the very first thing that Ford does is issues a full pardon to Richard Nixon for what he did. And this could be the beginning of the end on the very first day for Gerald Ford, because a House subcommittee is very rapidly pulled together, and they grill him over whether or not Nixon has bribed him to do this. Because remember, Nixon appointed his own successor here. Okay, the rest of the country didn't necessarily have to say yes to Ford, but because Ford seemed like a very level-headed individual, they said yes. And Ford's approval rating drops from 71% to 49% in a single day. And this, of course, ends up crippling his presidency thereafter. I mean, everything else ends up being completely eclipsed by this. Okay? So he opposes several increases in federal power. He vetoes 39 bills passed in Congress in only 15 months. And by the fall of 1974, the U.S. has the deepest recession it's had since the Great Depression. Unemployment jumps to 9% by 1975. And the federal budget deficit hits record highs. And Ford tries his best to come up with some kind of a slogan and some kind of a little catchy thing that he can pitch to Congress and that he can pitch to the American people. He refers to it as WIN, whip inflation now. But by 1975 to 76, the deficit grows from 53 billion to 74 billion. So inflation isn't really being whipped at all here. And he's so unpopular, and he gains the attention of a lot of conspiracy groups. One of them is actually a former Charles Manson devotee named Lynette Fromm. Sometimes she's called Squeaky Fromm. She actually walks up to him while he is leaving to get in his car, and she tries to shoot him in the chest, but her gun misfires. Okay, she's actually tackled to the ground and was actually imprisoned at Carswell Air Force Base near Fort Worth here in Texas up until probably about 10 years ago when she was actually released. Ford, in terms of his foreign policy, he retains everything that Nixon did just because Nixon's stuff seems to have worked. Okay? Kissinger is still made the Secretary of State, so that hasn't changed. And all the stability in the Middle East and the friendly relations with China and the Soviet Union all have to be maintained in order for the U.S. foreign policy to continue to work. Meanwhile, Israel promises that it's going to return most of the Sinai territory captured in 1967 back to Egypt. So even Israel is going to try to make some kind of a concession here. And Ford, in the meantime, is the president who is actually in office when Saigon falls. Okay, so he's actually ends up inheriting something that was a bigger mistake than he could have perhaps anticipated. By the time we get to the election of 1976, okay, only a couple of years after Ford is put in office, both political parties are in complete disarray. Right, there is no real confirmed leadership on either side of the aisle. Okay. Ford has to fend off challenges from all kinds of conservative Republicans, including former film actor Ronald Reagan, who eventually becomes president in 1980. And the Democrats, meanwhile, choose James Earl Carter Jr., who only has served as one term as governor of Georgia. And Jimmy Carter is a former naval officer and an engineer who has become a peanut farmer. Okay, and that kind of becomes his little, I guess, quaint association that goes along with him, is that he's kind of a small town guy. And Carter says that he is going to try to move America away from this whole idea of a tax and spend liberalism. Okay, even though he is a Democrat, he's kind of a moderate Democrat. Okay, he's not going to really engage a whole lot with social welfare programs or anything like that. He's very eager to slash budgets when and where he can. And he promises he's never going to lie to the American people. Okay, so we'll kind of end up seeing how all that ends up playing out for him. And he is also one of the first presidents, if not the first, to tout the fact that he considers himself a born-again, quote-unquote, Southern Baptist. In other words, he is a practicing Christian, and in this case, a Christian fundamentalist. And Carter wins 41 million votes to 39 million for Gerald Ford. So, again, the country is still very evenly divided at this point, and it's only by a relatively small margin that Carter ends up winning. And part of the reason why Carter ends up winning is because there is a large turnout of African Americans in the South who are now voting exclusively for the Democratic Party, and they favor Carter over Ford. And Walter Mondale is chosen as the vice president. He's a very big favorite among a lot of blue-collar workers. But because of the Watergate scandal and because neither candidate really appeals very much to the rest of the country, the turnout for votes in this particular election is relatively low. So from this point forward, we really start to see a downturn in voter turnout for a while, and also a bigger resurgence in political conservatism.